So in this video, we're going to evaluate the effects of the exchange rate with reference to the Marshall-Lerner condition, as well as the J-curve and reverse J-curve. So the Marshall-Lerner condition states that in order for a depreciation or devaluation to improve the trade balance and reduce the current account deficit, the combined price elasticities of demand for exports and imports have to exceed 1. And we're going to work through an example so you understand this perfectly. The more price elasticity of demand for exports and imports exceeds 1, the smaller the devaluation or depreciation needed to reduce the current account deficits. If the PED for exports and imports is below 1, then the government should pursue a revaluation to reduce the current account deficit. So let's go through a worked example of the Marshall-Lerner condition. And so let's pretend we have an exchange rate of £1 to $1.50. And let's pretend that we're the UK. And so from an exports perspective, the UK sells 40 items to the United States. And so if the United States is wanting to buy things from the UK, they have to pay in pounds. And so each item in the UK is sold for £10. And so the US has to pay $15 per item. Total sales in pounds is going to be 40 items times £10 per item. It's going to be £400. So the exports are worth 400. From an import perspective, let's pretend UK buys 50 items from the US. And so they have to pay in US dollars. So each item costs $30 in the US, but is now converted to £20 in the UK. So the UK has to give up £20. So the total cost in pounds is going to be 50 items times £20. It's going to be equal to £1,000. So we have a trade deficit, right? Because our imports value is larger than our export value. In fact, our UK exports are £400. UK's purchases or imports are £1,000. We have a trade deficit of £600. And so let's pretend now the currency devalues. The pound sterling value drops, and now the two currencies are equal. £1 is equal to $1. Well, what's the export revenue after devaluation? Well, let's pretend that the PED for our exports is 0 to keep things simple. The UK price doesn't change, right? It's still $10, but now converts to the US price of $10 because they're now equal. Total sales, because the PED is 0, is still at 40 items times £10 per item, is still £400. And so the UK's export revenue remains at £400. What about imports? Well, with PED for imports at negative 1.2 or 1.2, that's just the number we're going to use, the UK price of each $30 item now rises 50% from £20 to £30 after the devaluation. Well, why does that happen? And that's because the goods still cost $30 in the US, but now instead of getting it for £20 after devaluation, we can only get it for £30. So the price went up by 50%. Now, according to our price elasticity of demand calculation, demand should fall by 60%, and that calculation is 0.6 divided by 0.5 is going to be equal to 1.2. Okay, so it should fall by 60%. So the UK now only buys 20 items from the original 50, so 50 times 0.4 is 20. And so the new import cost is going to be 20 items times £30 per item. It's going to be £600. So the UK is importing less, which makes sense because the value of the pound has dropped. And so there's a new trade deficit. It's still a deficit, but it's now smaller. Well, if export revenue is 400 and import expenditure is 600 pounds, then the new trade deficit is going to be 200 pounds. This is actually an improvement of 400 pounds from the original deficit of 600 pounds. So this is an example of how if we add together the price elasticity of imports and exports and we get a number bigger than 1, in this case it's 1.2 because we ignore the negative sign, then a currency devaluation actually improves the current account. Keeping that in mind, there's a J-curve effect. And so The J-curve effect says the PED for imports and exports are inelastic in the short run because consumers and producers take time to adjust. And so a devaluation will worsen the current account in the short run before it improves in the long run. Why? Because the devaluation happens first, and consumers and producers take time to change the amount they want to buy. Okay? They take time to change suppliers to a different country, right? And so because they take time, there's a time lag between when the devaluation happens or when the depreciation happens and when producer and consumer behavior change. And this in-between time is called the J-curve effect. And so initially, the current account deficit might actually worsen. The reverse is true also. The reverse J-curve effect says similarly, a revaluation or a appreciation might increase the current account surplus in the short run before it decreases it in the long run. And so if we think about what revaluation or appreciation does to a currency, is it makes imports cheaper and exports more expensive. And so theoretically, it should decrease exports and increase imports, and it should contribute to a current account deficit. But we're saying that because imports and exports are inelastic in the short run, the opposite happens first, and then in the long run, current account goes into more of a deficit.